What if some of the best, healthiest vegetables simply vanished from our plates? Long ago, Roman farmers grew 10 remarkable superfoods that most of the world has forgotten. Let's dig into them and uncover what we've been missing. First up, skirret. Beneath the damp soil of a Roman garden, fingers worked through the earth with quiet purpose. There were no gloves, no metal tools, just skin, dirt, and instinct. What they sought wasn't grain, nor gold, but something softer, sweeter, and far more fragile. Skirret. It came out tangled, a cluster of pale, narrow roots, knotted like threads of bone. Skirret didn't look impressive, but to the Romans, it was treasure. When roasted, it turned tender and sugary. When boiled, it soaked in spice and broth like a sponge. Its flavor, halfway between parsnip and carrot, with a whisper of pepper, made it prized in kitchens from humble cottages to noble villas. And in winter, when the soil froze and choices ran thin, it was often the only sweetness left to eat. Unlike modern crops bred for symmetry and speed, skirret had no interest in perfection. Its roots split unevenly. Its harvest was unpredictable. It grew slowly, sometimes failing altogether if the earth turned too dry. But Roman farmers understood it. They nurtured it. They knew the plant gave its best only to those with patience, the kind passed down through generations, not written in books. In the scrolls of Roman herbalists, skirret appeared not just as food, but as medicine. They believed it could calm the stomach, sharpen the appetite, and even stir the blood. Whether those claims were true or not, one thing was certain: it fed the body gently, without heaviness. And that mattered in an age when illness came easily, and hunger was always close behind. Skirret wasn't grown in sprawling fields or stamped into trade ledgers. It was personal. It lived in garden corners, near the kitchen doors of those who knew how to treat it. You wouldn't find it on the carts of big city merchants, but rather in clay pots or woven baskets, passed hand to hand, root to root. It belonged to a world where flavor wasn't measured by market value, but by memory. So how did such a cherished plant disappear? The answer lies not in failure, but in change. When the empire began to crumble, so did its small farms. New rulers brought new crops. Medieval tastes turned toward sturdier roots, faster, larger, easier to clean. Skirret faded not because it was weak, but because it didn't fit the rush of the new world. Over centuries, it slipped quietly from recipe scrolls and seed satchels. By the time cities rose and machines took the land, skirret was all but gone. Today, it survives only in rare heirloom gardens and the pages of forgotten books. Most people wouldn't recognize it if it were laid on their table. And yet, it remains one of the gentlest, most sustainable roots ever cultivated, demanding little, giving much. In a sun-baked field far from the marble steps of Rome, dry wind pulled dust from the earth, and the roots of survival pushed deeper. Here, under skies that offered more heat than mercy, Roman farmers sowed a crop both dangerous and essential. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sweet, but it kept people alive. Lupins. At first glance, they looked harmless, smooth, round beans in a pale yellow shell, clustered on hardy stalks. They grew where others failed, in rocky soil, in dry fields, in the shadow of olive trees. They didn't ask for much, but they demanded one thing in return: understanding. Because lupins were poisonous. Raw, they were packed with bitter alkaloids that could sicken the body, slow the heart, and twist the stomach. But the Romans didn't throw them away. They worked with them. They knew that with time, patience, and the wisdom of ancestors, bitterness could be turned into strength. The process began with water, not just a splash or soak, but days of washing in flowing streams, sometimes 7 days, sometimes 10. The beans were placed in woven baskets, weighted with stones, and left where the current could whisper its transformation. The bitter compounds leached away slowly. The water turned milky, then clearer. And then, finally, the beans were safe. Cooked with herbs, pressed into flat cakes, or eaten by the handful, lupins were not a luxury. They were an answer. An answer to hunger, to poor soil, to the question every farmer asked when looking at empty land. What can grow here and still feed us? And lupins replied, I can. They became a favorite of Roman legionaries. Light to carry, rich in protein, they were tucked into packs alongside dried figs and hard bread. For the poor, they were roasted with salt and oil, eaten like nuts. For farmers, they did double duty. After harvest, the plants were plowed back into the ground to feed the soil for the next crop. Even their failures nourished future success. But lupins also carried a warning. Stay too long with them, and they'll remind you of what they once were. Improperly prepared, or eaten too quickly after soaking, they could still harm. The lesson was simple. Trust the old methods. Respect the process. Never rush what nature made bitter for a reason. As centuries passed and trade routes expanded, other legumes arrived. Softer, faster, sweeter. Chickpeas, lentils, beans that didn't need tending in streams or checking by taste. Slowly, the rituals around lupins began to fade. The baskets vanished. The patience wore thin. And in the shuffle toward convenience, the bitter bean was left behind. Today, most don't know what a true Roman lupin looked like. In some places, a distant cousin is still eaten, but boiled, processed, softened beyond recognition. The sharp edge, the story, the wisdom, forgotten. And yet, lupins endure. Their seeds still lie dormant in soil no one bothers to till. They still grow wild in corners no machine has reached. In a world gasping for protein, for drought resistance, for resilience without chemicals, lupins are already here, waiting. Not every Roman vegetable grew in neat rows. Some pushed up through stones. Some lived between bricks. Some refused to be tamed, and yet fed more people than the emperor's estates ever could. Among them stood Alexander's. It grew like a challenge, tall, dark green, defiant. Its leaves stretched out like wide-open hands, soaking up light from alley corners and temple gardens. The stem was thick and hollow, its scent sharp, its taste bold. Something between celery and black pepper. Not elegant, not soft, but unmistakably alive. No one planted Alexander's. It simply appeared. On the edges of fields, in the gaps between city walls, along roadsides where wagons rolled past. For Roman peasants, this wasn't a crop. It was an ally. When money failed, when fields gave nothing, when markets emptied, Alexander stood tall, green, edible, unbothered. Cooks didn't need scrolls to know how to use it. Stalks were chopped into broths, leaves simmered with lentils, seeds crushed and scattered over porridge. Boiled with vinegar, it became a bitter tonic. Steamed with olive oil and garlic, it became something close to a feast. It gave flavor to the flavorless, life to the bland, not with sweetness, but with sharp, bracing force. It was the vegetable equivalent of waking up, but it was more than taste. Roman herbalists wrote of its warming properties. It was said to stir the blood, ease the stomach, and purge excess. It was a plant of action, not rest, a food for those who needed to move, not those reclining on couches. In that way, it belonged to the laborers, to the stone haulers, to the women who baked bread through the night, to the children who carried water from fountains 2 streets away. Alexander's didn't care about class. It cared about presence. If you walked past it, you noticed it. If you picked it, it answered. But as Rome changed, as imported spices grew more common, as elite tastes demanded subtler greens, Alexander's was replaced by parsley, by celery, by crops with milder voices and smoother textures, things easier to market, to tame, to sell. And so Alexander slipped out of gardens and back into the cracks. It never stopped growing. It simply stopped being seen. Today, it's called a weed. Something to cut down, something in the way. But in truth, it's still there, still edible, still bold. In abandoned courtyards, along old stone fences, on the edges of cities, Alexander's waits. And with it, waits a memory. of the kitchens that made do, of the cooks who made great, of the people who didn't have much but had enough. Where land ended and the salt wind began, Roman farmers found a plant that didn't beg for care, didn't demand rich soil, and didn't wilt under hardship. Sea beet thrived where others failed, along the fractured rocks of the Mediterranean coast, where storms screamed and sun bleached the edges of the world. This was not a field crop planted in rows or bartered in markets with polished coins and measured sacks. Sea beet was wild, coarse, and unruly. Its leaves were thick and leathery, dark as oil with red veins that looked almost bruised. It grew low and stubborn, hugging the earth as if bracing against the next gust of brine-soaked wind. To the Roman eye, it was not beautiful, but it was powerful. Those who lived close to the shore knew it by touch and scent. Its flavor was deep, earthy, slightly bitter, and unmistakably green. It was a survivor's taste, not delicate, but dependable. People gathered it at low tide, bringing home armfuls wrapped in cloth. Still damp from the sea, it went into stews, lentil broths, and flatbreads. Sometimes boiled down with vinegar, sometimes eaten raw when nothing else remained. Sea beet didn't just feed, it endured. It laughed at drought, shrugged off salt, and rooted itself into sand where cultivated vegetables would have never dared to sprout. And perhaps most impressively, it gave birth to others. It was the mother of chard, the ancestor of sugar beet, the great-grandparent of every table beet sliced in salads today. But while its descendants were tamed, fattened, and sweetened, sea beet remained itself, lean, rough, wild. The Romans didn't try to change it. They didn't need to. They harvested and returned, year after year, accepting the plant's terms. It was not a crop to be controlled. It was a gift to be respected. In a world increasingly ruled by discipline, taxation, and military structure, sea beet was a reminder that nature still had its own will, and sometimes that will was generous. It's easy now to forget that much of Rome's food came from margins, from the coastlines, hillsides, forest edges, and dry gullies. Sea beet represented those margins. It belonged to fishers, to salt workers, to women who washed linen in tidal pools and picked leaves on their walk home. It never made it into imperial feasts or marble kitchen mosaics, but it was there, and that mattered more than glory ever could. When the empire fragmented and the sea lanes became dangerous, when estates collapsed and imported goods dried up, sea beet kept growing, but slowly it was replaced. Garden chard, softer, bigger, prettier, took its place. People stopped gathering. The wild corners grew quiet. Yet sea beet never disappeared. To this day, it grows untamed along the same shores, from Italy to Britain, its seeds scattering in the wind, its roots locked in salt. Most walk past it without knowing. Some call it a weed. Others don't notice it at all. But in an age where we speak of food security, climate resistance, and sustainability, it waits, ancient, patient, ready. It does not need fertilizers. It does not need perfect soil. It only needs space to breathe, time to grow, and someone willing to taste something real again. There are plants that disappear slowly, fading over centuries until no one remembers their shape, their taste, or their names. And then there is silphium, a vegetable so rare, so desired, and so mysterious that it vanished while the world was still watching. It did not die in silence. It died surrounded by longing, lamentation, and the terrible knowledge that its absence was caused by human hands and hungry mouths. Silphium grew along a narrow strip of land in Cyrenaica, a coastal region of North Africa, where the soil held secrets and the rain never came in excess. It refused to grow anywhere else. Roman botanists tried transplanting it, tried coaxing it to thrive in new places, but the plant resisted all change. There, in that thin thread of earth between desert and sea, it grew alone, wild, temperamental, golden. Its stalk curved like a question mark, its leaves curled with strange symmetry, and its sap oozed thick and aromatic. with a scent that clung to hands and robes for hours after touch. The Romans did not just cultivate silphium. They adored it, praised it, hoarded it, and consumed it in quantities that no plant, no matter how miraculous, could endure for long. Its flavor, said to be something between garlic and leeks, but richer, more complex, was added to sauces, meats, and even drinks, where a single drop could transform the dullest gruel into something worthy of poetry. But silphium was more than a taste. It was a cure, a charm, a symbol. Roman physicians used it to ease coughs, soothe stomachs, and treat fevers. Women took it as an early form of birth control, trusting in its power to regulate the body and protect against unwanted conception. Its value was so great that its image was stamped onto silver coins, carved into temple walls, and written about in breathless admiration by naturalists and poets alike. Silphium was not just a crop. It was a miracle. And yet, the miracle ended. The land that gave it life began to fail, grazed down by livestock, eroded by use, drained by those who saw only profit and never pause. The harvesters came too often, pulled too much, waited too little, and did not listen to the silence that followed the emptying fields. By the reign of Nero, only one stalk was said to remain, and that final plant was plucked and sent to Rome, not to be planted, not to be preserved, but to be admired, displayed, and consumed. No seed was kept. No cutting survived. Silphium left no descendants. It is gone. We still speak of it today with reverence, but our hands are empty. Coins still bear its shape. Texts still describe its smell, its sap, its unmatched worth. But no garden grows it, no field remembers it, and the tongue will never taste it again. Silphium teaches us something no modern crop dares whisper, that abundance is not safety, and reverence is not protection. The Romans revered it so much they consumed it to extinction. They couldn't imagine a world without it, until they had to live in one. In that silence lies a warning. Every time we treat nature's gifts as limitless, every time we believe beauty is ours to take without limit, we walk the same path Rome walked with silphium. It was not forgotten by accident. It was destroyed by hunger, disguised as admiration. What comes next is no myth, no ghost, but a green still growing quietly along the paths we no longer walk. It was not carved onto coins or buried in tombs, but it fed the sick, wrapped the wounded, and stayed faithful to the poor. Not every Roman vegetable came from tended fields or manicured garden beds. Some appeared like quiet miracles on the edges of life, in the cracks of stone courtyards, the shadows of alleyways, and the wind-swept corners of communal wells. Malva was one of those plants, overlooked by wealth, underestimated by power, but deeply trusted by those who actually lived close to the land, who bled, labored, and aged under the sun. It grew without permission, without boundaries, without pride, stretching its wide, soft leaves under doorsteps, beside granaries, along temple foundations, and wherever the soil remained untamed by design. Its flowers, soft pink with purple veins, swayed gently above the dust, never shouting for attention, but always present, always ready. To the Roman elite, it may have been invisible. To the plebeians, the servants, the herbalists, and the midwives, it was irreplaceable. Roman families gathered malva not in harvest festivals but in daily acts of care and necessity. The leaves, full of moisture and gentle oils, were stewed into soups for the sick, minced into pastes for children with fevers, wrapped around boiled grains or roasted meat when other greens were scarce or too bitter to soothe. The texture was soft, the flavor mild. But what it offered wasn't taste. It was balance, ease, and a quiet fullness that settled the stomach and warmed the limbs. But it wasn't only food. It was medicine, sometimes the only one within reach. Roman healers prescribed malva for inflammation, for burns, for chest ailments that rattled the lungs with every breath. Its mucilage, a natural gel within the leaves and stems, coated the throat, softened the skin, calmed the bowels, and was as much a balm for the anxious as for the injured. Midwives used it in childbirth. Soldiers carried it for wounds. It lived in the folds of tunics, the pouches of grandmothers, the corners of kitchens where knowledge passed through hands, not scrolls. Malva did not advertise its greatness. It simply existed, generously, gently, without praise. It fed those who had no silver to spend, and it healed those who could not afford a physician. It was not glamorous. It was not rare. It was simply good. And yet, as Roman agriculture shifted toward market demands, as imported herbs and flashy spices began to dominate the palate of the wealthy, Malva slipped quietly out of memory. No one banned it, no one uprooted it. But it was no longer mentioned in the halls of planners or included in the organized rows of villa gardens. As medicine became professionalized and divided from food, Malva found itself excluded, not because it had failed, but because the world changed its values. Today, Malva still grows, unnoticed, unloved, in the places no one tends, behind train stations, beside fences, along forgotten footpaths. Its leaves still hold healing. Its flowers still sway in the same rhythm. But most people step over it. They do not ask what it is, what it can do, or what it once meant to those who had less than we do now, and, perhaps, understood more. Bringing Malva back is not about creating a trend or resurrecting a lost delicacy. It is about remembering a relationship between land and life, between what feeds and what heals, that our ancestors held sacred even without saying so. It is about honoring the plants that never abandoned us, even when we stopped noticing them. Before ships brought cane sugar from distant colonies, before sacks of imported dates lined marble counters in the villas of Rome's elite, sweetness came not from distant oceans or foreign palms. It came from beneath the cold, heavy earth in the form of parsnips, a root that tasted of frost, of patience, and of survival. When the air grew thin with winter and even the olive trees paused their whispering, Roman peasants turned to what still slept beneath the soil. They dug with stiff fingers and crude wooden tools, breaking through the frozen crust to find the pale, thick-bodied roots coiled silently in the dark. These were not glamorous crops. They were not delicate, not beautiful, but they were there. Always. And they fed the people when almost nothing else would. Parsnips needed time. They asked for a season of rest before they gave their best. Only after the first frost did their flesh begin to sweeten, their starch transforming into sugar as if the cold itself were a secret alchemy. No Roman needed to read a treatise to understand that. They tasted it. They learned from the land what no scroll could teach, that some gifts arrive only through endurance. They roasted them whole, letting the skin blister near open flames. They boiled them into broths where lentils, onions, and vinegar mixed into a dark, fragrant comfort. Children chewed them like sweet sticks, and soldiers carried dried slices to chew during long marches through enemy lands. In poor homes, parsnips were mashed with stale bread, wrapped in leaves, and fried in oil when available, turning into warm, golden cakes that lifted hunger from the belly, even if only for a while. But it wasn't just a food of the desperate. Roman cooks in wealthy households embraced parsnips for their ability to mimic luxury in leaner times. Mixed with spices, honey, and wine reductions, parsnips appeared at feasts where guests never guessed that the centerpiece of their dish had once been the last hope of a starving farmer. More than a flavor, more than a texture, the parsnip carried meaning. It meant winter wasn't final. It meant sweetness didn't belong only to those with gold. It meant the earth could still give back even after the sun turned its face away. In this way, it nourished not just the body, but the belief that spring would return, that warmth would follow, that endurance had value. And then, slowly, it faded. The fall began not from failure, but from replacement. Newcomers arrived. Carrots bred orange in uniform. Sugar made cheap through empire. Potatoes brought from the other side of the world. In the race toward faster yields and stronger flavors, the parsnip's quiet richness was forgotten. Its crooked shape, its long growing season, its need for frost. All of it felt inconvenient, unprofitable, old. But the parsnip never left. It still grows, in cold corners of gardens, in the seed collections of quiet farmers who remember. It still sweetens after frost. It still waits to be tasted by those who are willing to wait for what matters. There were vegetables the Romans celebrated, vegetables they traded, seasoned, praised in poetry, or served in lacquered bowls to guests reclining on cushioned couches beneath ceilings painted with gods. And then there were vegetables like chickling vetch, which no one praised, no one admired, but which still saved lives when nothing else could. This plant was not planted for pleasure or prestige. It was planted for survival. Chickling vetch didn't thrive in luxury. It thrived in suffering. It grew in dry fields where the soil cracked from thirst, in corners abandoned by wheat and barley, in the shadow of droughts and wars where food was not a matter of enjoyment but of existence. It could grow when the rains failed, when the rivers sank into dust, when the empire's supply wagons stopped coming and hunger sat with every family like an uninvited ghost. Its seeds were small, pale, and slightly angular, easy to dry, easy to store, and harder than most teeth could manage unless boiled into submission. Its flavor was unremarkable, something between lentil and chalk, but it filled the belly, and when the alternatives were none, it mattered more than flavor ever could. But chickling vetch carried a warning in its marrow. When eaten for too long, too often, without rotation or variety, it turned against the body. A disease called latharism could creep in, a creeping paralysis of the legs, a slow, merciless tightening of the joints that robbed the poor of their last freedom. Movement. Roman physicians knew this risk. Peasants feared it, and yet they planted chickling vetch anyway, not out of ignorance, but because starvation was worse. And when the world offered no kindness, this seed still gave something. Families rationed it carefully, mixing it with herbs, stretching it with flatbread, boiling it for hours to lessen its grip. It was not food for the strong. It was food that made you strong enough to endure until better things returned. Chickling vetch was never invited to banquets, never depicted in mosaics, never honored with statues or festivals. It lived in sacks behind doors, in wooden bowls on soot-blackened hearths, in the hands of mothers who whispered thanks even as they stirred a pot they wished they did not have to make. And yet, in those homes, it meant everything. In winters when livestock perished, in years when harvests failed, in border villages where grain shipments never came, it became the only line between childhood and starvation. No one praised it, but no one forgot it either, because when hunger wrote its name across the land, chickling vetch answered with roots and silence. Its resilience was unmatched. It didn't demand rich soil or tender care. It asked only for a little space, a little time, and a person who still believed tomorrow might be worth preparing for. Today, it survives in only a few corners of the world, still growing quietly in places where hardship lingers, places where drought still burns the ground and where resilience is not a trend, but a condition of life. Not every Roman meal was grand. Not every plate was colorful, seasoned, or meant to impress. Most of Rome's population, the plebeians, the freedmen, the farmers, the slaves, lived not by banquets, but by what could grow reliably in stubborn soil. And at the center of that quiet, uncelebrated survival stood the turnip. It wasn't rare. It wasn't exotic. It was not praised in poetry or carved into mosaics. But the turnip was there, year after year, season after season, pushing its pale, swollen form out of the cold earth like a clenched fist refusing to let go. It could survive drought. It could endure poor soil. It could last in storage through the wet, dark winters when hunger sat in every corner of a Roman home like a sleeping dog no one dared wake. The taste was plain, sharp when raw, soft when cooked, but the value was never in its flavor. It was in its weight, in its endurance, in the way it filled a stomach when grain ran thin and nothing else remained but a fire, a pot, and a hope that spring would come sooner than expected. Turnips were sliced into stews with lentils, mashed with garlic, fried in olive oil when it was available, and even pickled in brine to be carried on journeys across the empire. Roman foot soldiers, marching through snow-covered passes or waiting out sieges, chewed dried pieces soaked in vinegar for strength. Farmers fed turnips not just to themselves, but to their animals. It was a crop that served the entire household, from human to mule. No waste, no excess, no pride. Unlike parsnips or skirret, the turnip held no hidden sweetness, no medicinal lore, no poetic charm. It did not cure illness. It did not seduce emperors. But it stayed, and that, in itself, was everything. It was a vegetable of the everyman. It belonged to people who could not afford to wait for ideal weather, who could not gamble their field on a fragile plant. Turnips gave back no matter what, in rain or drought, in war or peace, in famine or plenty. It was not about taste, it was about trust. And yet, even this quiet, faithful root was pushed aside over time. As richer crops spread through empire and into memory, potatoes from the Americas, rice from Egypt, even the more delicate carrots from the eastern provinces, the humble turnip became less and less respected. It was seen as crude, primitive, a symbol of poverty and lack. Kitchens wanted refinement. Markets demanded novelty. The world forgot the steady drumbeat that once kept hunger at bay. But what we forget does not disappear. It waits. Even now, the turnip grows easily, without chemical aid, without deep tilling, without luxury. It remains one of the few vegetables that can restore poor soil, feed both livestock and man, and resist pests without poison. In its plainness lies its power. In its silence lies its strength. To bring the turnip back into respect is not to elevate the unremarkable. It is to finally recognize that survival is not built on elegance. It is built on endurance. That history was carried not by delicacies, but by roots like this one, pulled from cold soil by tired hands, cooked over open flames, and eaten without complaint. In the warm, damp lowlands of southern Egypt and across the humid banks of the Nile, far from Rome's marble columns and pine-crowned hills, there grew a root with wide, spreading leaves that moved like shields in the wind. This was colocasia, a plant of deep water, thick stems, and starch-rich corms, known today in other corners of the world as taro, but once a quiet presence in the Roman kitchen, both foreign and familiar. Unlike turnips or parsnips that pushed their bodies into the cold, dry earth of the northern provinces, colocasia demanded something else: still water, thick mud, constant heat. It was not a vegetable of the hill country or the battlefront. It was a plant of the river, the basin, the settled field fed by canals carved by hands that understood the river's rhythm better than any calendar. It needed patience. It needed presence. And in return, it offered comfort. The Romans encountered colocasia not in Latium or Campania, but as part of their slow, consuming spread across Egypt, absorbing not just land, but wisdom, customs, and crops. They saw it growing in flooded gardens and temple courtyards, its leaves so large they could shade a child from the midday sun. Egyptian farmers harvested the swollen roots with curved blades, washed the dirt from their skins, and simmered them into thick, earthy stews that clung to the ribs and warmed the spirit. When Roman settlers tasted it, they found something different from the food of home, softer, more yielding, with a flavor not sharp or bright, but grounding. It reminded them of home and exile at once. In wealthy villas, colocasia became an exotic novelty, a dish served with honey and wine sauces, cut into slices like soft bread, occasionally mixed with nuts and dried fruit to mimic cakes. In rural kitchens, it remained humble, a food for tired bodies and quiet evenings, made with salt, oil, and nothing more. Colocasia was starchy, rich, and filling. It gave bulk to a meal, the way bread might, but without grain. For those too poor to own grain mills or too far from urban markets to buy flour, it became a substitute, a bridge between hunger and enough. But it was not without caution. Its raw flesh, full of oxalates, could burn the mouth and throat if handled or cooked improperly. The Romans learned this the hard way, and over time, they refined its preparation, boiling, fermenting, softening, until the root surrendered its gentleness without its fire. Still, colocasia remained a plant on the edge of Roman food culture, admired but not central, present but not proudly claimed. It belonged to the far provinces, to the places where Latin was a second tongue and Roman law walked beside older gods. Its history was tangled with empire, with conquest, with exchange, with the quiet mixing of peoples and practices that happened not in the forums or senates, but in gardens, in pots, and in the steam rising from the evening hearth. As centuries passed and the empire fractured, colocasia faded from European memory. It continued in Africa. It flourished in Asia. It was carried east and south, renamed, reshaped, folded into cuisines that held it tight while Rome let it go. Today, it is known by many names: taro, dasheen, calo. But its Roman name is almost forgotten, its place in ancient farming quietly erased. The Roman world is long gone. Its temples are ruins, its roads broken, its language fading into study and ritual. But the food it once grew, the plants that fed its armies, healed its sick, and gave comfort to its poor, still speak in silence beneath our feet. They do not cry out. They do not demand attention, but they wait, buried in memory, scattered in seed banks, growing wild in forgotten corners of fields we no longer bother to walk. The 10 vegetables we've unearthed are not curiosities from an antique world, nor mere artifacts to admire behind glass. They are survivors. They fed people through war, drought, sickness, and empire. They were grown not with machinery or fertilizer, but with patience, observation, and ancestral knowledge passed through generations by calloused hands and quiet mouths. In a time when the modern food system grows brittle under the weight of its own complexity, these plants offer more than history. They offer a path forward. Skirret, with its delicate sweetness, shows us that flavor does not always come from sugarcane or factory vats. It can rise slowly from cold soil, if we wait long enough. Lupins remind us that protein doesn't have to come wrapped in plastic or soaked in pesticides. It can grow in the poorest ground, bitter until tamed, powerful once understood. Alexander's proved that what we call a weed today may once have been the difference between hunger and survival, flavor and blandness, endurance and despair. Sea beet teaches us to respect the original, the raw, the coastal strength that lives on in its cultivated descendants, but has never lost its wild pride. Silphium warns us of what can never be restored, of how easily the miracle becomes memory when profit is allowed to speak louder than protection. Malva offers a healing too simple for modern medicine, one that comes not in pills or prescriptions, but in leaves and care, in soup and touch. Parsnips return sweetness to its roots, not packaged or powdered, but drawn from frozen earth as a reward for patience in the dark. Chickling vetch dares us to look at the foods we forget to honor, the foods of desperation that still save generations from extinction. Turnips stand as monuments to the ordinary, to the power of plain food that asks for nothing and still gives everything. Colocasia whispers of empire's margins, of exchange, of absorption, and of the plants that outlived the cities that once tried to rename them. These 10 plants are not gone. They are not extinct. They have been ignored, overshadowed, cast aside by the rush toward convenience and the cult of uniformity. But they have not disappeared. They have endured. They require no laboratories to revive, no global supply chains to deliver. What they require is recognition, a decision, a return. In a time when climate change scorches fields, when modern crops wither under new stress, when biodiversity shrinks and taste is sacrificed for shelf life, the old ways whisper again. These vegetables are hardier than we are. They have already survived collapse once, and in their genes, in their roots, in their quiet presence, they carry instructions for how to do it again. Replanting them is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of rebellion. against forgetfulness, against fragility, against the myth that progress only moves in one direction. It is also an act of hope, that our future meals might be rooted not in dependency, but in resilience, in knowledge, in the kinds of food that once helped an empire survive the impossible. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.